Good evening and welcome to Cooperative Vermont. I'm Matthew Kropp.
And I'm Eric Davis.
And we're coming to you live the Cinco de Mayo 2013. We've got a few updates, news items from the world of Vermont cooperatives, and then we will be having an interview with Don Jameson of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, having a conversation about the center, kind of what it does, different forms of employee ownership, and their upcoming conference in June. But first, the news.
Yeah, well, an update on a story that we've been following for quite a while now. Granite City Grocery, the initiative to start a food co-op in downtown Barrie, reached their goal of 600 member pledges very recently, and we had the opportunity to hear Emily Sanders Kaminsky talk right after they reached the goal. So it's really exciting that it looks like that project will happen.
Yeah, we've been following this one long enough. I just kind of wish I brought some confetti and I could start throwing around because the key was they were sort of pushing for the 600. Their goal was to have 600 members pledge before they called in equity, and then have the ultimate goal be to have, before opening the store, recruit 1,200 members. So they're up to that 600. They're going to be calling in the equity soon. And sort of being able to then have those resources available to really sort of seriously go into getting sort of potentially the space and using that as to leverage to obtain outside financing. And it's really sort of a big milestone for them.
Absolutely. And hearing Emily speak about that initiative too, they're doing some really great work and really building support organically in the community, and it's really exciting.
Yeah, and if you want to check out the video of Emily talking about the organizing process, you can go on our Facebook page or go on our YouTube channel, Cooperative Vermont, and you can find her sort of going over that process. And we've had a little bit of feedback from people at two other startup food co-ops that are not quite as far along as them, Southshire Market down in Bennington and the Morrisville Co-op, the MoCo or Morrisville Co-op. Obviously in Morrisville. Mm-hmm. And so there's definitely, it's cool to see this startup energy going, and I heard some good feedback from them, and I think we might even try to facilitate a conversation between them at some point in the near future. But sort of on the topic of startups kind of hitting milestones, another big milestone was the Keep BT Local campaign. For those of you who've been kind of following it, the campaign to turn Burlington Telecom, or purchase essentially Burlington Telecom from the city of Burlington by a cooperative of subscribers to the service, has incorporated and successfully held its first elections. Mm-hmm. The nominating committee, of which actually Eric and I were both members, certified kind of the final results, and the board of directors met for the first time this past week. So we have a picture of the board kind of at their first meeting. I was able to only stay for the first piece of it and then had to run off to another engagement. But it seems like there's a good mix of folks. It was a competitive election. There were 11 candidates, 7 slots. So you see up there Deb Shannon, Alan Matson, Laredo Sola on your right. And then there's sorry, I'm totally blanking. There's Shay Totten, Pete Jewett, and then 2 others who I'm totally blanking on the names of. Do you remember?
Dave Mount.
Dave Mount, that was his name. And who's the former city councilor?
Andy Montrell.
Andy Montrell, yes. So that's the 7 who will be kind of guiding the process from here on out, and kind of when the settlement with city capital is made. These will be the folks who will be kind of responsible for entering into negotiations with the city, and kind of doing outreach, kind of coordinating all the many things going on. But that doesn't mean they're going to be the only ones working on it. There's committees working on marketing and kind of doing the technical side of things on the website. So if you're interested in this project and want to get involved, you can pledge at keepbtlocal.com. And you can take the next step and kind of step up and get involved in any of the committees that are working.
And not only was it a competitive election, I think about half of members that were eligible to vote cast a ballot.
It was more than half. It was like 66 or 68%. So it's pretty good, especially in age when many co-ops have elections in which a fraction of a percent vote. But yeah, so that's kind of another big thing that we'll be continuing to follow and bring you updates on as time goes on. Now, there's another thing that we've been both working on very hard and very tired and very happy that it's done. But it's the Owning the New Economy conference at UVM. In our last episode, we brought some excerpts from from one of the lead-up events, which was the sort of the state of Vermont's cooperative economy, which brought together a bunch of folks, including our guest this evening, to discuss different elements of the Vermont's cooperative economy. But the conference itself brought together people who are both interested in cooperatives and divestment and alternative finance, and I thought it was in a lot of different tracks and projects, and I felt like it went off pretty well.
I think it was great. The cooperative track sort of focused on a morning session and an afternoon session, with the morning session sort of envisioning the cooperative economy, and Keith Taylor from is it University of Illinois?
I think it's University of India. He's a fellow at the Ostrom Institute, but I think his PhD is through University of Illinois, so it's kind of both.
He gave a fantastic talk, I thought. And the afternoon sessions really focused on how to really build a co-op economy. Everything from keeping the democratic culture alive, financing co-ops, and what it actually takes to start up a new co-op. So
we've got two videos. First one's a short one that is just kind of from the beginning of the day, us with a few of the organizers, so you can get kind of a sense of who was involved and the kind of energy that was going on as we were just about to kick off the conference.
Hi, here's Greg Bove at the beginning of the Vermont New Economy conference, the Owning the New Economy. Yes, looking around, we see the registration tables. Some severely stressed out Alex Perlman over there. Wave, Alex.
So yeah, we were having fun.
Yeah, and Greg Bove actually gave a fantastic interview for VPR leading up to that event. Mm-hmm. So that's definitely on vtneweconomy.org, as well as probably on our site as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you want to find video from the conference and from a bunch of the sessions, not all of them got video taped, but a lot of them did. So you can find that video. It's embedded on the vtneweconomy.org website. And then, one thing, there's a lot of different conversations, different presentations that happened, but we just wanted to show one short clip from Avram Pat's talk. There's discussion in the second co-op session about both kind of how to do activism within existing co-ops and also sort of the ideas of starting new co-ops. So this is him just talking a little bit about some of the challenges that co-ops face as they age in terms of their democracy.
Early on, when I started getting involved in co-ops, of something some people call the 30-year syndrome, which is it's a generational thing. You have the founding generation of Washington Electric Co-op. 30 years later, that founding generation is either not there anymore or they're moving on. And very frequently, things get set in their ways. And they've become more conservative, and I don't mean that in the political sense. And people kind of forget why they've moved away from that founding spirit. And frequently, or sometimes, a new generation shows up and says, hey, wait a minute. I can go to meetings and vote. I can get elected to the board. There's some things I think I might want to change or see done differently. And there's often the 30-year syndrome in a lot of co-ops, and Washington Electric actually went through that at around that time, where that's when it started. The real struggle within the co-op for the future of the co-op.
So that was just him, Avram Pat of the Washington Electric Co-op, kind of touching on some of the ideas around sort of how kind of the initial cooperative spirit can flag in an organization, but he goes on in that talk, and you can find that on our YouTube channel as well, to sort of really dive into sort of kind of what the experience of Washington Electric Co-op in terms of their own governance and democracy, and what sort of what things that they've changed in order to kind of make things accessible and open to the members in terms of governance and elections and things like that.
Right. Yeah. And building out of that conference, it was so great to have all these cooperators together and chat about the potential of cooperatives in Vermont and opportunities for cooperatives. So building out of that, we decided that we should probably get cooperators together more often. So we're planning a co-op happy hour. The first will occur May 29th at 3 Needs from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. And we hope to make that a regular event.
Yeah, it's something that the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance put one of these on recently, and it seemed to be a really good experience for them. And I think it's kind of one of the things that's been lacking in Vermont is sort of a kind of sense of a community of cooperators. And so, kind of if we can have a sense of, okay, there's a group of people who have shared interests who will be coming together on a somewhat regular basis and get to know who's out there and what skills they have, and if there's a new project going forward, knowing who to talk to maybe make that new cooperative project succeed. Right. Really kind of creating those linkages in social capital is, I think, an important task. And so, as silly as it may seem to be like, oh yeah, we'll be building the co-op movement by going and drinking beers for an hour and maybe playing Coopoly.
Well, we talk a lot about breaking down those silos, and this is an opportunity to get everyone in the same room and talking about where we can cooperate. So. Yep.
So again, if anyone out there, if you either are work for a co-op or volunteer at a co-op or just an interested co-op member and think co-ops are cool, come on Wednesday, May 29th at 5:30 p.m. It'll be in the Frank Lloyd Wright room, which is you go into the 3 Needs and then you'll kind of go around the bar and there's kind of a private room on the side, and there should be a little sign up. So hope to see you there. But so that's the roundup for the co-op news. So now we're very, very happy to welcome to the program Don Jameson of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center. Welcome.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for inviting me.
Do you want to maybe kick this off by giving us a little overview of what the VEOC is and kind of what work you guys do?
Sure. The VEOC has been around for, well, it depends on when you reckon the date, but somewhere around since 2001. And we're a statewide organization. We're a nonprofit educational organization which promotes employee ownership of all forms, employee stock ownership plans and worker cooperatives and sort of amalgamated forms also. So we do this by holding an annual conference, which is coming up June the 7th, and the 11th one. And we also go around the state giving workshops, sometimes with people from employee-owned companies to describe the virtues and the reasons that people might want to go in that direction. We also will talk to people from individual companies who are interested in pursuing this path, see if it makes sense for them, talk to them about expenses, and give them referrals to professionals who can help them. In some cases, especially with worker co-ops, we sometimes help get them a little farther along the road than with ESOPs. And maybe I should talk a little bit about it. When I use the word ESOP, I should define my term. An ESOP is an employee stock ownership plan, not stock option plan. There are a few other possible manglings of that. So employee stock ownership plan, and it's the most common form of employee ownership in this country. It's actually trust ownership, where a trust is created to hold stock on behalf of employees. Employees don't actually own the stock directly themselves. They're entitled to the value of the stock when they leave the company. So it's a way of sharing equity with employees, but not necessarily control.
So in that case, if the stock is held by this trust, who then, how is the kind of ownership of the trust determined, right. Or how does control work?
Good question. Good question, Matt. It's determined by the trustees, and who are the trustees? In some cases, especially with larger companies, they'll hire an outside trust company to provide trust services for the ESOP trust. In smaller companies where they're trying to save money, or because they're concerned about outside people making major decisions for their company, there are internal trustees. In a lot of cases, those are managers. In some cases, well, it can't be the former owner. Yeah. So a lot of times they're managers of the company. They can also be, you can have an elected person as part of a trust committee. That doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen sometimes. It sounds like there's a lot of potential conflict of interest, and there is, but there's a lot of law that says that when the person is acting as a trustee, they have to act in the best interest of the beneficiaries. So there have been suits, of course, when people think that management was doing bad stuff with their company. So that's actually the most common form. As I said, there are about 11,000 ESOP trusts in the country. Something like 4,000 to 5,000 of those are majority-owned ESOPs. There are also worker cooperatives, and that's kind of the democratic pole of employee ownership. And I don't know how many of you guys say there are, but we would guess in the mid, somewhere around 500, something like that, 400 or 500 worker cooperatives in the country. In the state, maybe 5 to 10, something like that. That's kind of, they don't have to actually declare themselves as cooperatives when they set up. They just have to have bylaws that specify the cooperative way of operating.
And so where did, how did in terms of this work of saying, okay, so employee ownership is kind of what you promote, what you support, kind of how does this project come into being?
The organization?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there was a predecessor organization called the New Leaf Cooperative Enterprise Program, which was based at the Burlington Community Land Trust in the late 90s. It actually came out of CVOEO through a long story, which I will have to document someday. It began as part of the enterprise community, which was a HUD-funded thing back in 97, something like that. Maybe it was before that. And I got some grant funding from the Campaign for Human Development to start this co-op development program. And the idea was to start up brand new worker cooperatives, benefiting low-income populations, starting up brand new businesses. It's kind of hard to do, as I learned. I mean, I knew it was hard, but it really is hard. And we got close with a couple of projects. There was one really interesting one. It was a window restoration company was the idea, and it was in partnership with a trade skills building organization. And we got pretty far with it, but the key people, things happened to them, like one of them had a baby and one of them had a death in the family, and things fell apart. So anyway, out of the rubble, and in the process of that, I met an attorney who did a lot of ESOP work. And he said, co-ops, that's really interesting because I have some clients who are in companies that are really too small to afford to do an ESOP, but, are pretty democratic and very open. And, he thought they actually might suit some of his clients. So we said, well, why don't we put together something that will offer the full range of possibilities for employee ownership? And we got together a steering committee, and one thing led to another. So that's kind of how it started.
I was reading on VEOC's website your mission to broaden capital ownership and provide community stability. And I was just sort of wondering if you could unpack that and expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Well, broadening capital ownership, all forms of employee ownership do that. So ESOPs actually do end up giving the average retiree from an ESOP company something like 2.5 to 3 times the amount of retirement benefits that an employee from a non-ESOP company gets. That's according to several different studies. So that's a broadening. It's actually giving working people access to wealth creation, like owning a home or some other property, which an awful lot of working people don't really own very much of. That's what the ESOP was created to do back in the 1950s, and it does that pretty well. So broadening capital ownership, we say a few other things too, but stabilizing communities, the idea there is that through ownership which is really rooted in more people, makes it less likely that the company's going to up and leave. If it's employee owned, even if it's ESOP owned, which is at one step removed from the employees, in even in those cases, it's less likely that the company is going to pack up and go to China or to Tennessee or somewhere else.
So you sort of frame these as kind of like two poles of like the worker co-op and the ESOP. What are the kind of benefits and drawbacks of each model that you see kind of from working with both? And like why do certain groups pick one over the other?
I guess the main benefit, there are a few great benefits to ESOPs actually. From the point of view of the exiting owner, the selling shareholder, they can sell as much or little of the company to the ESOP as they want to. So they can start it slow. They can start with just a couple % of the ownership of the company, see how it goes, see how it feels. The management of the company does not have to change drastically because, the idea is that it's supposed to be run for the benefit of the employees. So if it's run well, if it's well managed, a well-managed company, it's fine, carry on. So those are a couple of benefits. There are also great tax benefits to ESOPs. Contributions which are made to the ESOP to pay down a loan to purchase stock are actually pre-tax dollars. So it's a really good way to finance ownership succession. And that's incorporated in the ERISA, Employee Retirement Income Security Act from 1974 is actually one that happened. And that's when we saw the great increase in the number of ESOPs. Because, I mentioned just in passing that the ESOP form came about in the 1950s, but there were only really a couple hundred of them by the time of the 1970s. So 20 years later, only a few hundred of them. Then it was incorporated in the tax code, and suddenly, people discovered it. Oh, wow, this is a great way to transition ownership. So those are, some of the great benefits of ESOPs. They do spread wealth. So there's a kind of a democratization, I guess you could say there, but they don't really entail a major change in management, which the co-ops do. If you're going to sell an established business to a cooperative, there are a few changes that have to happen. Now the workforce is actually in the position of ownership. They elect the board of directors. At a minimum, it's going to be, that they're electing the board of directors, which is setting policy for the company, strategic direction for the company, hiring and firing the general manager or director or whatever you call them. So those are big changes. So the worker co-op is on the democratic end of the spectrum. The ESOP can be democratically structured. Not very many of them actually are. More and more of them are highly participatory workplaces, because if they are, that's when you get real company performance enhancement. There are a bunch of studies that document that. And ESOP by itself doesn't seem to make a lot of change in the performance of the company. But couple it with real participation where people's ideas are solicited and ideas for cost saving and open book management, that's when you really get the kick. And it can be significant. I do ramble on, don't I?
So in terms of the kind of the work that you do right now in Vermont, do you see employee ownership as something that tends to kind of come out of a startup thing, where you'll have people who kind of start a business and then want it to become employee owned, or does it tend to be more something where you have an established company and an owner wants to exit, and then there's the option of either selling to another single owner, or going public, or selling to the employees, and they choose selling to the employees. Kind of what's...
Yeah. Worker co-ops, I would think it's pretty safe to say the majority of worker co-ops start up as worker cooperatives. And we've already said there aren't a whole lot of them. In this state, the ones I can think of off the top of my head, top of my head, Green Mountain Spinnery is one of the oldest ones, was formed actually as a worker cooperative. Data Systems in Burlington, there are a bunch, some of which have come and gone, like Common Ground Restaurant, which was a worker co-op for many years, and Cherry Hill Cannery, and all startups. So a few companies where there was an exiting founder who really wanted the business to become a cooperative. Red House Building is an interesting case where it wasn't really an exiting founder, but the owner of sole proprietorship building business called Walnut Street Builders had been approached by his employees who said, we'd really like to continue working with you, but it's much more rational for us to go off and form our own companies now. We'd make a lot more money if we did that. How about figuring out a way to share ownership with us? So they found a good example and transitioned ownership to a cooperative that way. Started out with 5 founding members, and it's grown since then. So that's one case of a worker co-op being born out of an established business, but usually they are startups. ESOPs are just about always in established companies. They're formed within established companies as a way of buying stock from somebody who wants to leave. A founder, oftentimes it's the founder of a small, closely held business. There are not very many ESOPs in publicly traded companies. They're most of them small, closely held businesses.
So one thing that I've been kind of curious about is thinking of transitioning from kind of individual ownership to employee ownership. You can think about someone who's like, okay, I want to retire, I want to get away from it. But there's also examples. I know there was an example of I think there's a company in England where it was an advertising firm, and they were bought out by another company, and then the employees all en masse just decided to leave and start their own company because it was so based on human capital and the skills that existed. Have you seen or that ever play into, or the threat of that, or that actually happen as a way of employee ownership happening? Like something's going badly with the existing owner or manager, and the employees decide, okay, we want to sort of we'll take employee ownership one way or the other?
Yeah, several stories. One of which I just have kind of reread, so it's a little bit fresh, but I'm a little fuzzy in some of the details. But it's one of the first stories of employee ownership in Vermont that I know of. That's Vermont Asbestos Group, which came out of the mine in, is it actually Lowell? I think is where it is, Belvedere Mountain in Eden, Lowell, that part of the state. And the parent company decided to divest because the EPA was requiring them to install some very expensive equipment. They weren't making enough money, and they said, heck with it. So they were going to get out. So the workers actually organized, with the help of a really interesting guy who was teaching at Goddard at the time, Frank Adams, who became, out of this experience, a great advocate for employee ownership. And they organized a buyout and got a bunch of banks, local banks, to form a consortium to help them buy this, multi-million-dollar business. So they ended up buying it. The stock value went shooting up. A lot of them sold because it was not a cooperative, and it became a not employee-owned company after a little while, actually not very long. And then the whole asbestos industry tanked, because of all the environmental problems with that. So that was kind of an interesting case. A little more typical, well, you were mentioning the advertising firm. So a similar case is PT360, which was a bunch of physical therapists, also, human capital intensive business, and a bunch of them were not very happy at the place they had been working, and they formed a new company and did it as a cooperative. So that's, there are a couple of stories for you anyway.
Because it seems like it's almost sort of an interesting alternative to union organizing. So rather than organizing a union at a workplace, you sort of decide that you want to sort of move into a space where you take ownership of the workplace.
Well, the company has to be for sale to start with,
Right.
Sometimes, there are some cases where an employee will, hear about employee ownership and talk to the manager. Maybe there's some friendly relationship who will talk to the owner, or, they can talk directly to the owner, say, this sounds like a pretty cool idea. Why don't you investigate that? And that does happen sometimes. But usually a profitable company is not going to look to employees as potential buyers. It just, it's hard to find the financing to really buy the person out. And ESOP can make it possible, but there's an awful lot that the seller has to do in order to make that work. So it's seller initiated always, just about always, except in cases of the company going down, like it's going to go bankrupt. In some cases, there have been unions, especially the steel workers, the automobile workers, And unfortunately, a case where it didn't work out was United Airlines, where the pilots union actually became part of an ESOP, where the union actually initiates a buyout or makes a deal, say we'll have some wage concessions in return for a chunk of ownership. Some cases that prolongs the life of the company. There are a bunch of steel companies in Ohio and Pennsylvania where that happens, where the company really would not have continued to exist but for a buyout by an ESOP. But again, they died after a while because the industries were in such trouble because of the global economy. So it does happen sometimes, but those are the toughest ones. And as Corey Rosen from the National Center for Employee Ownership would like me to say, says ESOPs happen usually in healthy companies, not when companies are going down. And it's oftentimes because it just makes sense to the owner, because there's self-interest involved, no doubt, because maybe there's not a great buyer out there potentially. But in some cases, there are outside buyers who would really like to buy the company, but the owner says, I'm sure they're going to move the company or consolidate it or something, and some bad things are going to happen to my employees, and they really care. I mean, I can tell you a bunch of examples in this state, for Sonex Industries, for example, down in Rockingham, where they had some strategic buyers who would have liked to have purchased that company, which makes automobile parts. And the sellers decided that they would sell to an ESOP rather than do that. So it's, it actually often happens that the seller really does care a lot about the employees. So,
in talking about the different ways the worker-owned cooperatives or ESOPs come about, it makes me wonder about sort of the range of culture and governance in worker co-ops. Do you find that there's a sort of a typical model, or there's a wide range of participation in governance? And
Yeah. I think there are really two basic models. I mean, this is in my simple mind, okay? But the cooperatives that call themselves collectives, they tend to be very flat organizationally. They often will share jobs. They'll do job rotation. They really think of themselves as equals in every regard. That kind of management is really, as somebody recently said to me, it's really management by policy. So that you have a handbook that really tells how we're going to deal with various scenarios and how we're going to run the company. And you've all agreed upon that. It can work really well. One of the leading cooperatives in VOC, the Valley Alliance of Worker Cooperatives, which is based in, there are a bunch of co-ops based in kind of north central Massachusetts. Collective Copies played a real leading role in forming that organization. And they have really worked out a lot of great policies to help groups that want to do that kind of a business. The other sort of management style that I'm seeing, especially in larger worker co-ops, is it looks more traditional in a lot of respects, where you have departments in the company and they are somewhat hierarchical. They might have department leaders or team leaders, they might call them. Red House has, by the nature of the construction business, there tend to be foremen or team leaders or supervisors or whatever, and it kind of lends itself to that kind of hierarchical structure. But larger co-ops like Equal Exchange, which is a pretty well-known fair trade business, a worker cooperative of, I think it's like 150 members now, based in Massachusetts, has departments, and it looks like a fairly traditional corporate structure, but the member workers elect the board of directors, which appoints the top management. So in working with an established company that's interested in converting to cooperative ownership, a lot of times it's important to preserve the management structure, at least initially, so there's not a huge drastic change in how the company operates day to day. We're working with a company now that's got a very strong leader at the top, and I think the idea is for her to stay in her job for a while after the new co-op board gets going, and they'll figure out how they'll negotiate that position when she leaves. But I think that's a really important thing to think about, how the company is going to be managed.
So one other thing that you mentioned a little bit earlier about the question of financing. So if you're, if there's someone, if you're out there and you're part of an organization, this conversations may be coming up. Where does that money come from? I mean, obviously employees, you have a job, so you can have a little bit, but a full buyout, you're going to need to find kind of other sources of capital.
Yeah.
So what are the sort of options for that?
Real Pickles is a company are they based in Greenfield, Mass? Do you remember?
Yeah, I think
so.
that's correct.
Yeah. They're doing a buyout right now, and they're raising capital to do the buyout by issuing preferred stock to their customers and supporters. Equal Exchange has raised a lot of equity this way also.
Can you sort of
Preferred
explain
stock?
what preferred stock is?
Okay. It's preferred in the sense that if the company is to go bankrupt, those stockholders will be paid out before the common stockholders are. But in a cooperative, preferred stock can be structured so that it's non-voting stock. So the members have their own class of stock that's got the full voting rights. The preferred stockholders don't have voting rights except on maybe a very few number of questions. So the people who do this are getting a certain rate of return, and there's usually a plan to buy back their stock after a point. So that can be one equity source. More common is financing through, say, something like the Cooperative Fund of New England, which is a fund which finances co-ops. They have a new equity fund also, but a lot of times a buyout can be done through debt financing. Most common, to be honest with you, is seller financing, where the seller, the person who's leaving, will take a promissory note saying, this company will pay me back over a certain period of time. The employees are not directly shelling out money to pay them out. They're paying for their member shares, but that oftentimes is not a significant enough amount to really make a difference in the deal. If it's a $500,000 company, and 20 people are going to be the first members, that would be an awful lot of money for people to come up with, people who don't have a lot of savings. So basically, it's what's called a leveraged buyout, which got a really bad name back in the 70s and 80s, but you're using the leveraging ability of the company to buy the company. So it can actually work to the benefit of employees.
Do traditional financial institutions sort of see kind of an ESOP or a co-op generally as something that they're willing to make loans for, or is it seen as something that's pretty exotic and risky and they're not quite sure what's going on?
ESOPs are pretty familiar to a lot of banks, larger banks especially. Merchants has done some ESOP lending in Vermont, Vermont-based bank, but local banks would be local branches of Citizens Bank and Key Bank and some of the larger banks. I don't know that NBT has done much ESOP lending, but the larger banks tend to know about ESOPs and they're comfortable with them. Small banks find them a little daunting because of all the regulation and scrutiny that comes with them. So they're a little reluctant sometimes. And sometimes they can't do a large enough transaction for some of the ESOP companies to do their business with them. I think banks are actually pretty comfortable with them. The traditional banker types sort of say okay to ESOPs because they're the collateral is the company, and there's a proven history of good cash flow and all that stuff that bankers look for. With co-ops, it's kind of case by case. If there's a really good relationship with a banker that the cooperative has formed over the years, they can sometimes get a loan for this purpose. But as I say, it's most often a seller note that does it, or a fund like the cooperative fund.
The Real Pickles equity financing and the equal exchange method, it seems like a great way to sort of build community support as well as equity. You brought up the Valley Alliance of Worker Cooperatives. How do you see the role of worker cooperatives collaborating with each other, cooperating, and sort of building alliances and building a larger cooperative economy?
cooperation among cooperatives, as you guys have mentioned many times. Yeah.
Beating that drum.
Yeah, well, I mean, I always, of course, my mind goes right to Mondragon, the network of cooperatives in Spain, where what is a certain percentage of the profit, or whatever you want to call it, of each cooperative goes to support the financing of new cooperatives through that central bank that they have there. That's a great thing when that happens. The Valley Alliance is they ask their member organizations to pay a certain amount. I don't know if it's something. I think it is an annual fee that they ask. Maybe probably percentage. I should really know more about that. But it is really trying to do that kind of thing here. And also, I should mention the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, which is a membership organization which is also trying to promulgate and promote and provide technical assistance to cooperatives, to worker cooperatives specifically. So that's really the way it's supposed to happen. And we'd love to see more of that.
So in terms of, you mentioned earlier that this conference is happening. In terms of kind of what's developing kind of in Vermont in terms of employee ownership, is there anything kind of that you're particularly excited about that seems to be on the horizon or coming up, kind of that will be either highlighted at this conference or just other things that kind of are on your mind?
I think this past year has been a kind of steady as she goes sort of year. I wish there were a big announcement coming, but there's not really, as far as I know. But there are a couple new ESOP companies. Chelsea Green Publishing is a recent one, and Chelsea Green, of course, publishes a lot of the best books out there on sustainable economics, and they recently put in an ESOP. They thought about a cooperative, but I think they felt that there really needs to be a sort of strong and unencumbered manager in that kind of business. And also they had a complex bunch of, sort of capital structure they had to deal with. They had to buy out a whole bunch of shareholders, and an ESOP seemed to be a better way to do that. So that's one new one. Sonics Industries is also a fairly recent one. CCS, another recent ESOP in Morrisville, crane company, construction company, another new ESOP. There's also Concepts NRC, which is they're kind of the turbine engineering geniuses, I guess. I don't know, they're famous. I don't know. White River Junction. It's a new ESOP company. And we have this one cooperative I've mentioned, which I hope that we'll be able to announce at the next conference, is the new worker co-op. There are, little co-ops thinking about forming, but it's still pretty early with a lot of that. I did just learn of a new cooperative, but they've been around for a little while, Web Skillet in Burlington. Jonathan Kassam, is that how you say his name?
I think so.
Yeah. So I keep learning about new collectives or worker co-ops that are around.
Following on that thought, after the recession, the Cleveland model sprang up in in Cleveland, in a particularly hard-hit area, as a way to sort of rebuild community wealth. Have you found interest in cooperatives at all to be piqued by the recession in Vermont as well?
There was a lot of interest. I found during the 2008, 2009 years, there wasn't a lot of activity, but there was interest. There were people really thinking about, oh my gosh, how am I going to exit this company? So thinking about ESOPs. And also people who are looking for new models of ownership and thinking about cooperatives. And I'm sure you guys, in fact, maybe the two of you yourselves, were inspired at that time to really rethink
the financial
all that
crisis
stuff.
was one of those kind of
Catalytic
watershed moments.
Yeah, for an awful lot of people. And the fact that there's this other corporate structure. The worker cooperative is a kind of corporation. You could say there's a corporate law in Vermont that defines the worker cooperative corporation. So it is a way of doing business that's on the books and that's been around for a long time, and it works. So it's exciting. It really is exciting. And the ESOP model is exciting too, showing that when you give people sort of some skin in the game, plus an opportunity to affect their job, the businesses do better. They perform better. I mean, there's all kinds of evidence that this is a better way of doing things.
So there was interest was peaked, and the evidence is out there. So what are some of the barriers that people encounter when they come to you and talk about establishing a worker cooperative or an ESOP, and then they don't take it to the next sort of step?
The people who are interested in forming a new worker cooperative a lot of times are very idealistic and very sophisticated in their kind of analytical skills and their philosophy, and they're good thinkers, but they don't have a lot of business background a lot of times. So that's an impediment for sure. They really have to learn how to sell stuff, and make money. That's very challenging, as I learned. And second, business owners who are looking at a worker co-op, who maybe are in a company that's too small to do an ESOP, which otherwise would be attractive, they can be daunted by the idea of there being this board of directors that actually would have power over somebody in their position. How is leadership going to work in that case? They really are skeptical. So all we can do is show examples of where it's working well. And some examples of a more hierarchically organized worker cooperative can be reassuring in some cases. ESOPs, a lot of times, I shouldn't say a lot of times, but there are sometimes cases where there's not a really strong next generation of management in the company. That's a really important thing, because if the present people who've built the company, and say it's a 40 to 50 person firm, a lot of times the one or two people at the top of the company are the ones who really know how to sell this stuff and manage it day to day. So they really need to be nurturing that next generation of management to take over. You can put in an ESOP and develop the new generation simultaneously, and it all unfolds over 5 or 10 years. That's a great scenario, actually. But that can be an impediment in some cases.
Yeah, it requires a lot of intention.
Yes. Yeah. And, if an owner wants to get out 2 months from now with cash, the ESOP isn't going to work too well, because it takes longer. It has to be done out of the cash flow of the business, so it's best if it's spread over a certain period of time, usually. That's the case. So it takes some time, and it takes a new generation of management, and it takes financing, and there are a lot of things. Yeah. It takes professional help. You really have to do it right to do an ESOP, or you can get in trouble, because they're federally regulated structures that the Department of Labor is actually rather aggressively auditing these days. Under the Obama administration, the DOL has more teeth than they used to, so that can be scary also. You have to be ready for an audit, and the IRS looks at you too. So,
and cooperatives have those complexities as well.
Well, they don't have that kind of federal scrutiny. And they do. They're operating under Subchapter T of the Internal Revenue Code, but that's not quite as scary a thing, I guess, as Department of Labor audits for ESOPs. And I don't think there are as many actual audits from IRS of cooperatives.
So if there are folks out who are kind of watching and thinking about, okay, like, in my workplace, this would be an interesting thing, or if I have a company, I would want to change it, kind of, and you've got this conference coming up on the 7th. What are the sorts of things that kind of someone would, you hope, your goal is for people to be able to walk away from that experience having learned? Kind of what are the opportunities there?
Well, I guess I'll talk about my 2 tracks again, my ESOP track and my co-op track. Well, first off, a newcomer who doesn't know whether they're interested in ESOPs or co-ops or both or whatever would go to the introductory session, the Introduction to Employee Ownership session, and they would come out with a basic understanding of those 2 forms and a couple of good stories. So then they would choose to go either to the Introduction to ESOPs, which is going to be this year interesting, a skit, a role play with a bunch of people in the position of being the banker, and somebody's the seller, the selling shareholder, and somebody's the Department of Labor, and somebody, et cetera. So we can kind of act out all the different roles that go into forming an ESOP. And that will, I think, make the whole thing really vivid for people. And there will be people who can answer questions along the way. The worker co-op track, We don't actually have a full-fledged introduction to worker co-ops. We'll do that quickly in the intro to employee ownership session. But then in the next round, there will be a great story from Equal Exchange. Rodney North, who's their big outreach guy, is coming up, and he's going to do a presentation on the history and the present operations of Equal Exchange. So that'll be really good. He's a really dynamic guy, and they have a great story. And then in the third round, somebody interested in cooperatives might go to the Converting a Business into a Cooperative session. I think I have to come up with a catchier name than that, which Melissa Hoover from the U.S. Federation and Adam Trott from the Valley Alliance will be sharing their ideas on how to do that. And we'll have, of course, another story or two. Probably Red House will be part of that session. And then in the end, we have an intriguing sounding session called What ESOPs and Co-ops Can Learn from Each Other, where Melissa Hoover and our keynoter, Lauren Rogers, from the National Center for Employee Ownership, he's the new executive director there, will sort of start a conversation on that subject, which we hope will become a big conversation. There's also a showing of a movie called We the Owners, which is sort of the employee's perspective on employee ownership. That'll also be happening in the last round of the day for people who are too exhausted to deal with more talking heads.
Is that, when you say it's sort of this film that deals with employee ownership, does it also kind of cover both styles? And
Yeah, it actually covers sort of three companies. One is Namaste Solar, which is a worker co-op. A second is an ESOP company called New Belgium Brewery. It's a beer brewery, which has just become 100% ESOP owned. And the third is one where it's neither ESOP nor co-op. They have a bunch of stock that they give people an opportunity to buy. And there's also, kind of incentives for managers. It's a little more traditional in a lot of ways, but it's a very empowered workforce and a lot of pride. And it's a big construction company with the union, so it's kind of an interesting story. So those three companies are profiled in this movie, which is, about an hour long, and we'll have a good discussion on that one too. So.
And the conversation that's happening between the keynoter and the
Melissa.
The worker co-op person, is that a conversation that's kind of happening nationally, or is it something that sort of the two models talking to each other is a new thing?
I have to say I pride our organization on encouraging that dialogue. They are such different models, we've already talked about that. And some people, co-op purists think, oh my God, ESOPs, that the employee, it's just not true. It's not really employee ownership because it's trust ownership, right? And that's true. So the dialogue does not happen very much. And it has happened a few times at our conference because we always have a track for co-ops, and we always have a lot of people from ESOPs and a real track for ESOPs. So the dialogue does not happen very much, and maybe we should say it's, a really important moment that this will be happening at our conference.
Cool. So for folks, again, that's June 7th at Champlain College. And I think people can go to, your website is veoc.org?
That's it, yep. And there's conference information on there, and, I'm always happy to get emails and things too.
So in terms of the national, if people are kind of wanting to get involved in this, going to this conference, what other opportunities are there out there for people who want to kind of dig in further and learn even more about employee ownership than they're going to get at one day? Yeah,
there are more conferences to go to. The ESOP World has a couple of big ones every year. The National ESOP Association has one in Washington in June, I think it is. No, it's April, May. And then they also have a technical conference in Las Vegas every year where you can really learn all the nuts and bolts. The National Center for Employee Ownership and the Beister Institute, which is based at UC San Diego, they have an annual conference also. The U.S. Federation has a national conference every other year. And in those other years, the Eastern Conference for Workplace Democracy has a conference in the East, and there's a similar organization in the West. So this year it's going to be in July in Philadelphia, the Eastern Conference for Workplace Democracy, ECWD, which will be great. There will be a lot of co-op people there, worker co-op people. Yeah.
So the conference is June 7th at Champlain College. Is that correct?
Yep.
I'm going to have I'm naturally drawn to the cooperative track, but I'm going to have trouble choosing between the skit and the co-op track. That sounds like a really great lineup, though.
Yeah. And there are student discounts available, and actually, I think we just put in a discount for newcomers, people from companies that are not yet employee-owned but are thinking about it. So it's a really nice discount. So people have to email me about that, though, which they can get my address off the website. So it's going to be good. And, and after that, I don't know if that's what you meant by, next steps, but companies that are interested in taking next steps, we will meet with them and get them headed in the right direction. A lot of times, the best thing that I can do is get people in touch with people in employee-owned companies, to answer their questions. Mm-hmm. So that kind of networking thing is, I think, one of our most important roles. And we'll get, particularly as I said, with worker co-ops, because there's not as much professional support for those organizations as there is for ESOPs. We can help kind of get them a little farther down the road than with ESOPs. A lot of times we'll get people through sort of a pre-feasibility assessment for an ESOP, and then they're ready to go to the professionals and figure out if it's really going to work and make it happen.
And so we've got just a minute or two left, but I was wondering if, maybe just to conclude things, if we want to step back from kind of we've been talking a lot about the individual companies nitty-gritty, but sort of in terms of kind of big picture changes or developments that in terms of employee ownership that you would like to see, or you're working towards, kind of what are things that people who are interested in this and supporting could be doing to kind of support the broader development of it?
Well, I should mention, this is not exactly answering your question, but there's an exciting development that happened a couple years ago where the steelworkers, the U.S. Steelworkers, the union, has an agreement with Mondragon, the great cooperative corporation in Spain, to form union worker co-ops, sort of where the members will be both union members and co-op members, and that's starting to get somewhere, I think. So that's really exciting to me to see where that's going to go. You probably, I don't know, we should talk about the history of worker co-ops someday too, but the relationship between co-ops and unions has been problematic in this country since the Knights of Labor fiascos that happened in the 1880s. Really at that point, the American labor movement backed away from co-ops, but now they're getting back, they're kind of rediscovering them. So that has a lot of potential, I think, for new growth. I'm especially excited about doing more conversions of established businesses that actually have a foothold in the marketplace and are good candidates for co-op conversion. That's really exciting to me. We're seeing some more activity there and a lot of interest. And the ESOP world is chugging along, and there's a big baby boomer demographic coming along. Lots of people are going to be selling businesses or trying to, and that's a huge opportunity for employee ownership of all sorts.
Yeah, definitely sort of potential to transition a substantial chunk of the economy. Even.
Right.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on and discussing this topic, and definitely looking forward to the conference.
Hope you guys will come.
I'll be there.
All right.
But so y'all have been watching Cooperative Vermont. We've been interviewing Don Jameson of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, and we'll be we do the show every 2 weeks. Our next episode will be showing footage from the conference. So if you can check that out also online. But if you'd like to sort of see that'll be on 2 weeks from now. And then you can always keep updated with on our website, coopvt.wordpress.com, Cooperative Vermont on Facebook, on Twitter. Lots of places to get the latest in Vermont co-op news.
If you only caught a portion of this interview, it'll be up within 24 hours, I'm sure.
All right. Well, thank you for watching. I'm Matthew Kropp.
And I'm Eric Davis.
Good night.